Hello, and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tuller, and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on June 1st with James Tanner. He will be giving a presentation entitled Finding Success with a Genealogical Research Strategy. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search in our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Alyssa Gamble, who will be giving a presentation on naturalization in the United States. Before we begin, here's a little bit about Alyssa. Alyssa Gamble graduated from Brigham Young University, Idaho in December 2021. She graduated with a degree in professional studies with 2 certificates in family history research. After graduation, she was an intern at the Family Search Library. Currently, she is a research specialist on the US and Canada team at the Family Search Library. She is in the process of becoming an accredited genealogist, specializing in the Great Lakes United States region. Alyssa has given presentations for Family Search, Utah Genealogical Association, and the South Bay Cities Genealogical Society. And we will now turn the time over to Alyssa if she's ready.
Perfect. Thank you, Olivia. Well, thank you so much. I am so excited to be able to be here tonight with all of you to teach you a little bit more about naturalization records for the United States. All of us do have immigrant ancestors, so finding these naturalization records can be the key to unlocking more records for your immigrant ancestors. So for today's class, we are going to go through a couple of objectives. First, we're going to review the history and background of the naturalization process. I will also explain the genealogical value that these various records might hold for your research. We then will learn how we can use the records in the most effective way, identify where we can find the records, and then I will present a case study where we're going to put all of this together and I could show you how you can apply it to your own research. So let's begin by reviewing the history of naturalization to help you understand why and what records were created. To start off, let's define what it is. Naturalization is a process for which a citizen of one country becomes the citizen of another. And today we're only focusing on the United States. And if a person was born in the United States, regardless of their parents' citizenship status or their parents' birthplace, that person was automatically a citizen because they were born on US soil. So why would someone want to naturalize? Immigrants would naturalize to receive more opportunities, but there's typically 3 reasons why someone might have become a citizen. First was to buy or sell land. One had to be a citizen, and owning land was a great economic opportunity for immigrants trying to start their new life in America. Another reason was for voting rights. This is very important for some immigrants to be able to have their voices heard when they might have been restricted in their home country. And then finally, they might have just done it for patriotic reasons. There could be various other reasons someone became a citizen, but these are the major ones. So who would typically naturalize? It is important to note that not all immigrants were required to become citizens. And as we saw on the previous slide, though, there were great opportunities if they did become a citizen. Some people also began the process of naturalization, but just never completed it. And I will discuss later why someone might not have completed the process. There's also group naturalizations, which can also be called collective naturalization. And the only requirement was living in a certain territory or be part of a certain group when the United States began considering that area or people citizens. A person had no choice of whether or not they were citizen. They automatically became a citizen with the group. So let's discuss that in further detail. So one of the group naturalizations is territories. And so this is not necessarily when a territory became a state. It could be when the United States started considering that territory part of the United States. So the first one happened in 1776 when the colonies separated from Britain. All living within the original 13 colonies were automatically became citizens, unfortunately, except for Native Americans or African Americans. And then there were various other territories, including Louisiana in 1803, Florida, Texas, and the Mexico Territory, Alaska, Hawaii, and even Puerto Rico. And obviously there are more territories, but these are just some of the major ones. So if you had an ancestor living in a territory when a collective naturalization happened, then they likely became a citizen just with the group, which means there would be no records for them. There were also certain ethnic groups part of collective naturalization. African Americans born in the US couldn't become citizens until 1868 with the 14th Amendment. And it took another 2 years until former slaves who were born outside of the US were given naturalization rights. Also, Native Americans were not granted collective citizenship until 1924. Asian Americans were also restricted from the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, but that was nullified in 1943 when race could no longer affect citizenship. I have in your handout the dates of all of these territory and group naturalizations, if you're interested. Another type of naturalization is called derivative naturalization. Derivative just means that a person received their citizenship through someone else. One group involved with derivative was women. It is a little complicated, but I will try to summarize it. 1804 was the earliest laws of derivative naturalizations took to effect and resulted in a woman's citizenship being mostly dependent on her marital status. By 1855, women could become citizens only if her husband naturalized or if she married a US citizen. The 1907 Expatriation Act would unfortunately remove a woman's citizenship if she married a non-citizen, even if she was a citizen by birth. The 1922 Cable Act did repeal the Expiration Act, meaning woman no longer lost her citizenship based on her marriage to a non-citizen. The exception was, though, that a woman who married someone of Asian descent would still lose her citizenship until 1931. So any woman who lost her citizenship between 1907 and 1922 could later regain it, and that occurred in 1936. She could only regain her citizenship, however, still based on her marriage. So that meant she could only regain it if her husband either died or they divorced. And then by 1940, her marital status no longer influenced her citizenship. So any woman, regardless of if they were married to a non-citizen or not, they could regain their citizenship that they had lost. I wanted to show you a quick example of a woman who had lost her citizenship and how you could tell if one of your ancestors might have lost their citizenship. I found this 1920 census for a couple, William and Mary. On it, we learn William was born in Sweden, that he had immigrated in 1882, and by the PA in the naturalization status, we know he was working on his the process to become a citizen. Mary was born in Minnesota, but she still has her citizenship status marked as AL, because which means an alien, and that is because she had married a non-citizen. I was then able to discover her oath to retake the oath of allegiance. And on it, we could see she was born in 1885 in Minnesota. She had lost her citizenship because of her marriage to William, who was born in Sweden, but she regained her citizenship once William died in 1929. Another example of derivative naturalization is for children. Between 1790 and 1940, minors could become citizens under their father's naturalization. Between 1804 and 1934, women could not pass their citizenship to their foreign-born children. And then from 1824 to 1906, a minor whose father wasn't a citizen could naturalize faster once they turned 21 if they had been living in the US for at least 5 years. In 1907, Congress required all children involved in derivative naturalization to register with a consulate once they had turned 18, and they would just declare their intent to keep their citizenship that they had already received from their father. And in 1934, to limit the number of children overseas becoming citizens, children had to have been living in the US for at least 5 years before their 18th birthday to receive that derivative naturalization. So as you can see, children might be listed in naturalization records, but they might not have been if it was through their father and they didn't have any more requirements needed to take. And all of the information on derivative naturalization can also be found in your handout. So assuming your ancestor was not part of a collective or derivative naturalization, this is the process they would have taken to become a citizen. This process did change over time, so we're going to divide the section into 3 time periods because the records also change over those 3 time periods. And that is pre-1790, 1790 to 1906, and post-1906. So let's briefly highlight each of these time periods. We're not going to talk too much about pre-1790, mostly because it is the colonial era that happened when America was still part of the British Empire and before they were able to get naturalization laws into effect. So if someone was already, and again, this is through British citizenship, this is not through United States. If someone was from British, if they were a British colony and they were from England or the United Kingdom, they automatically were already a citizen. So they did not need to become a citizen of the colony since they already were a citizen of the UK. However, those non-British colonists had to naturalize under the British rule. It is a very lengthy process, including having them to have to travel back to England to do the paperwork, so not many people did. There are 3 types of naturalizations in this era. We have denization, which is partial. This would allow a person to vote and buy land, but they could not run for office or pass land to the heirs. There's oath of allegiance, which is full citizenship. And then finally, we also have our collective citizenship, which, just a reminder, in 1776, all those living within the United States automatically became citizens. The next time period is 1790 to 1906, and there are certain steps needed to take to become a citizen. The government required the person to be in the United States for at least 5 years, had to have at least 2 to 3 years between their paperwork. They had to stand for good moral character, appear before a court, usually that was a local or state court. And within that process, they had to complete 3 records. First was the declaration, also called the first papers, then the petition, which is the second papers, and then the certificate of citizenship. And then our final time period was after 1906. And this is when the Bureau of Immigration Services was created by the federal government. That department later became the INS, which was the Immigration and Naturalization Services. And then later in 2004, it dissolved into 3 sections. One of them was the USCIS, which stands for the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. It's important to note these 3 names in case you need to help locate records, but these records are now located at the USCIS. So besides the creation of the federal departments, there were other changes that occurred in 1906. Forms became standardized, which makes it a lot easier to know what you're looking for. They also contain more information and were easier to read. There were mostly federal courts that would naturalize, though local and state courts still could. Copies were kept by the federal department, which again today is the USCIS, so it is easier to locate. And then just like in the previous time period, the records again are still the declaration of intention, the petition, and the certificate of citizenship. And many of the requirements were also the same. So now that we've discussed the history, let's dive into the genealogical value. So as I mentioned, there are the 3 time periods. So we're going to talk about the genealogical value of the records in those 3 time periods. But before we do that, let's discuss why we want to use naturalization records. The biggest reason is to identify the homelands of your immigrant ancestors. Not many records specifically state the city or town that your ancestors came from, but naturalization records can. That would then move your research past America and into their homelands. Naturalization records can also help you find immigration records if you haven't already located them, such as passenger lists. They also can help you identify relatives of your ancestors, since these records can list family members or witnesses that could be family members. It's also part of their story. Immigrants did struggle a lot coming into America, having to start over their life. So learning about their life through naturalization records will really help you connect with your ancestors. So let's go over each time period. So let's start with the colonial era. Remember, there are 3 types of naturalizations in this era. We have denization, which is partial, oath of allegiance, which is full, and then collective, which again happened in 1776 and involved no paperwork. So you're really only going to find records for denization or oath of allegiance. Here is an example of a pre-1790 naturalization record. On it is a list of men who took the oath of allegiance. For this line, we could see that on the 9th of June, 1780, John Lemmy from Spain, who was a merchant, naturalized. As you can see, there is not a lot of information found on colonial naturalization records. Typically, it holds the person's name, their country of origin, the date they naturalized, and their residence. But even with such little information, you can still use it in your research. It's beneficial because it can maybe help you move your research into their homelands, since it gives you a country. And it also can help you identify where they were living in the colonies, gives you another pinpoint on their map of where they were at, which could help you find additional records. So let's move on to the records after 1790. You will find a lot more information than you would in the colonial records. These 2 time periods are very similar since they do have the same records. Just remember, the major difference is in 1906 when the federal government took over the records. So forms were standardized regardless of where they were in the United States, and more information was asked. So we have the 3 records: the declaration, the petition, and the certificate. So we're going to discuss each of these records, and then we're going to compare them between the 2 time periods. Let's start with the Declaration of Intention. It is also known as the Declaration or the First Papers. This is when the person just needed to declare to the court that they were interested in becoming a citizen. In order to file, the person needed to be of age, which would be either 18 or 21, depending on the laws at the time. They could begin to declare right off the boat, but many did wait a couple of years before they began their process. This is important to note of the time frame of when someone might have become a citizen when they started that process. It most likely was recently after they arrived. These papers could also be filed in any court in any state, so it can be a little difficult to locate. Your ancestors could file in the court nearest to their home. It could be closest to the port they arrived in, or really anywhere in between. So let's look at some examples for the declaration. This is the 1790 to 1906 declarations. As you can see, there is not a lot of information on this one in the top left. It is completely handwritten. The one below it is a printed out form. This one is from New York. And then the one on the right is also from New York. I forgot to mention the one in the top left is actually from the territory of Washington. So as you can see, all of them look different because there was no standardized forms during these times. So you never really know what you're going to get or how much information you're going to get. Let's look closer at this New York Naturalization Declaration. Let's zoom in and we can learn a little bit more about this record. We could see that James Boyle was renouncing the Queen of Great Britain and Ireland, and then it gives us the date that he declared, which was the 8th of August, 1850. So as you can see, at least we know he's from Great Britain or Ireland, but we really don't know too much about him other than this. Let's look at a post-1906 declaration though. This one is actually from my own ancestor, Peter Lewis Benz. And when you zoom in, you could see there is a lot more information that you could find. We're going to analyze this in a moment, but I want to show you something that you might be able to find additional records in post-1906 naturalization records. I actually found his facts for declaration of intention, which basically in the top, it tells you that a copy of this form will be furnished by the clerk. So that way, my ancestor Peter wrote himself on the facts of declaration. He gave it to the clerk, who then copied that information over to the actual declaration, which we saw on the previous slide. I absolutely love this record because I compared his signature with the rest of the handwriting, and I know he actually wrote on this document. You can also tell English was not his first language because of some of the spellings that someone later came by and corrected. You could also tell in the bottom, in the green circle for the month January, he actually included an umlaut over January, which is how you do it in German. So that is another evidence of that English is not his first language. So since I found both the facts of declaration that Peter filled out himself, and then I found the official declaration, which the clerk copied over the information onto, I'm able to compare the facts just to verify that the information is correct. On this record, I was able to learn about his name, the date he declared, when he was born, and specifically where he was born in Switzerland, his current residence, and as well as immigration information, including which port he left from, when he arrived in New York, and which vessel he was on. So let's move on to petitions. The petition is also known as the final papers or second papers, and this was to petition the court to grant the citizenship. There were more requirements for the petition than the declaration. They had to be filed at least 2 years after the declaration. The person had to live in the US for at least 5 years, but there is an asterisk because it sometimes was 2 years, sometimes was 11, just depended on the laws at the time. They had to live in that state for at least 1 year. They had to attest for good moral character. And again, the papers could be filed in any court in any state. It even could be different than the court that they declared in. So just know you might not find the declaration and petition in the same court. So let's go to the 2 different time periods. First, we have 1790 to 1906 petition. Again, they look different depending on the court or the state, just like with their declaration, and they also could vary in length. This petition is for John Relly, and it actually is 2 pages long. So if you take a closer look at the top portion, this is where we learn which court he's at. It tells us he's a native of Ireland, when he arrived, and it gives a witness, which based on the last name could be a relative, as well as the date that it occurred. But if we look at the second page, the middle portion actually gives us a lot more information, including specifically where in Ireland he was born, his birth date, his age, and even more about his immigration, where he migrated from, the port he arrived in, and when he arrived. So because we located both pages of the petition, a lot of people don't check to see if there's 2 pages of a document, but that's why it's always good to browse all of your records. We were able to identify a lot of information about John, his birth, and his immigration, which could lead to many more records. After 1906, the petitions again are standardized and typically only on 1 page. But it is always important to look to see if there's multiple pages, because occasionally the declaration is actually attached to the petition, as you can see on the left side of your page. But let's go back and focus on the petition. On this is where we can learn information about Henry, including his birth, his immigration, as well as when he declared. So if we didn't have his declaration, we could use this information to find it, but it also gives us facts about his wife as well as his children. So you could see that this is very valuable and has a wealth of information. The final record is the Certificate of Citizenship. It also could be known as the Certificate of Naturalization or simply the certificate. This was when the court was granting the citizenship. The requirements were the person had to give their oath of allegiance, stating they no longer assigned with their previous country. This could be a separate piece of paper, or it could be recorded on the back of the petition. And if it was a separate piece of paper, then the person would receive the certificate from the court, and the court would keep the certificate stub. The certificate also had to be filed in the same court as the petition, so this could help you find the petition if you know the certificate. Just note though, not all certificates have been kept by the court, and the stubs haven't been kept by the court, and the certificates might not have been kept by the person themselves. So you might not be able to ever locate their certificate. Certificates between 1790 and 1906 could be more difficult to locate since courts don't always keep those records, but they can be found on the back of the petition. So if we look at this record for Charles, we can actually see that he wrote out his oath just at the bottom of his petition. Doesn't really give us much more information, but this is what the certificate would be. There are some records, however, that could keep a copy of the certificate, such as a homestead application. In order to get a homestead, a person did have to be a citizen. So within their application, they could include their certificate to prove that they were a citizen. So if you ever get a hold of a homestead application packet, browse through it and see if you could find a certificate that mentions their naturalization. Zooming into this example, we could see that Henry, he received a certificate from the circuit court in Orange City, which means he would have had to petition in that same court. And it also tells us that he is a native of the Netherlands. For certificates after 1906, you again might not find the actual certificate, but you're more likely to find the stub. We could tell that this is a certificate stub just because of the perforated edge that you could see on the right side of the image next to the black line. On this stub, we could see on the top portion, we learn about Joseph, gives us his age, and tells us exactly about his declaration and petition, which we could use this information to locate the actual records. And even on the bottom part of the stub, we also get his wife's name, his children's names, and all of their ages and residence, which is incredible to have on something so small as a certificate stub. So that was a lot to cover. So let me just quickly summarize the records after 1790. Again, we have our two time periods, 1790 to 1906, and then post 1906. We have three records. We have the declaration, the petition, and the certificate. And the major difference between each of them is that if in 1906, the federal government began to control the records, so they hold more information and you know what the forms look like since they were standardized. So now that we've gone through each of the records, let's discuss the value that they hold. So the value of 1790 to 1906 records are that they typically include a person's name, their country of origin, and the date they naturalized. They might include their port of arrival, immigration date, age, and birth information. And they can greatly benefit you because you can find immigration records. You might be able to find their country of origin, maybe even more specifically their city of their homelands, as well as maybe even identify relatives that might have been mentioned, whether they were through derivative naturalization or they might have been a witness. And then this the benefits of the post-1906 records is that they can give you more specifically the town of origin. They could give you birth information, very exact birth information, as well as immigration. They can provide you their current residence, which could help you find them in other records, as well as the spouse and children information, including birth dates, and it would greatly help you find clues to other records. So that was the genealogical value. So let's go ahead and discuss how you need to use these records to get the most out of them. The first thing you need to do is read the entire document. At the Family Search Library, when I'm helping guests, a lot of the times they have the answer, they just don't realize it if they hadn't read the record entirely. So make sure that you are making note of every single name, date, place, witness. Basically, make note of every single field. You never know what key information could clue you into something else. You also don't want to be missing any pages. Some of these records can be found on multiple pages. Typically, the declaration is only 1 page long, but you never know. The petition is more likely to be multiple pages, especially during 1790 and 1906, but you never really know. And as well as the certificate can be located on the back of the petition, which is always good to check if the petition has multiple sides or multiple pages, as well as a certificate of arrival. That is a document I haven't talked about yet. In 1906, the federal government created Certificate of Arrivals. Basically, they copied information over from passenger list into the Certificate of Arrivals. And a lot of the times they are within the same packet as a declaration and petition are found. So if you have an ancestor who naturalized after 1906, you might be able to find a certificate of arrival. So let's look at an example of why it's important to read the entire document and to find all of the pages. So when I zoomed into this record, we learn a little bit about Christian. He's a native of Germany. He's age 24, and we get when he naturalized. This is great, but I wanted to see if there was any more information about him. So I browsed the images surrounding this image, and I was able to find 4 additional pages. The first page is just the court's card for their organization. The second image was an affidavit for issuing a new naturalization paper in lieu of one lost or destroyed. The third image was a letter from Christian to the court explaining why he needed a new certificate. And then finally, the final image was a letter from the clerk informing that the certificate was received. So from these 4 pages, as well as the one previously, I was able to discover more about Christian. I am specifically given the court that he naturalized in. So if he received his certificate from the District Court of Eastern Pennsylvania, I know he received his petition from there as well. I also get his residence. I also learned that his wife actually lost their certificate together with other articles at the Wanamaker store. 1, this proves he was married, so I could look for a marriage certificate. And 2, maybe they worked or lived near this store. And then finally, I know that he needed to prove his citizenship in 1924. So this could mean maybe he wanted to vote. So I could search for vote registers around 1924. Or maybe he wanted to purchase land. Or maybe he just wanted to become a citizen. But since I know he needed to prove it for some reason, there could be additional records I could search for. So one of the key things that you need to do when using these records is to evaluate. This means extracting all of the information. You need to analyze the reliability. Even though these records are government official records, they needed to be accurate since they were becoming citizens. You never really know how reliable the information is due to memory. So if you find a birth date, there is a chance they might have misremembered their birth date. So you just need to really analyze the reliability of the record, the information, as well as comparing it to other things you have to determine how reliable it is. Similarly, compare facts with what you know and what you already have to determine how reliable it is. You need to pinpoint what is conflicting, and then you need to resolve that conflicting information and draw a conclusion of the record and of your research. Doing this could help you guide your research to additional records such as birth records, marriage, or death. They also could help you identify relatives, which could also find immigration records, or even their residents, which could help you find census records or city directories or other records. So as you can see, naturalization records hold a ton of great information, and if you are properly using them and analyzing them, you will be able to greatly expand your research of your immigrant ancestors. So now that we know more about these records, let's do the next step and learn how to find them. To better help you find them, you need to know some things before you begin to search. First, you need to know names. Names are the most difficult part about finding immigrants because a lot of the times they would change their name, either because they couldn't pronounce them, or they went by nicknames, or they Americanized them. So you need to come up with as many possibilities of what their name is and could have been spelled, any nicknames they might have gone by, any initials they could have used, and also consider language barriers and accents and how someone might have spelled the name based on how someone pronounced it. And if you know the country of origin, that is greatly going to help you just be able to verify that you found the right person. If you know about when they were born, that can help you identify them, as well as when they immigrated. You also want to consider if they were collective or derivative naturalization, because if they were, you're going to be searching for a record that doesn't exist. And knowing where they lived in the US can also help you narrow down which courts you need to be looking at. And remember, the declaration and petition can be in any court, and they don't have to be where they were living, but at least it could help you narrow down where they might be. So before you find a record, you want to look for clues. And here's a list of different records that you can use to help you find your ancestors. I'm going to go quickly through each of these. Census records are the best way to get a basic understanding of if your ancestors naturalized and when they immigrated. So this table can actually be found in your handout, and this just highlights the different information that can be found in each of these different census years. And we're going to focus on the naturalization status. So in 1820 and 1830, you might not think it has a lot of great genealogical values since only the heads of the families were included, but they still can help you with your research because there actually was in column number 14 asking if they had any foreigners that were not naturalized yet. Next, we have 1870. This also can help you determine if they were a citizen or not. In column 19, they would mark whether they were a male citizen of the United States over the age of 21. So if you look over on the left, we have column 10 asks for the birthplace. And then next to it asks about their parents' birthplace and whether they were foreign born or not. So you could use a couple of these columns to determine whether or not the person might have become a citizen either through naturalization or if they became a citizen through birth. So for example, the person who was born in Maine, since they were born in Maine, they would have been a citizen by birth. But the person who was born in England and their parents were also foreign born, they would have become a citizen through their own naturalization or potentially their father's naturalization. Next, we have 1900 to 1930. There was a column asking about their naturalization status, and they used different codes. So AL would be for if they were an alien, meaning they were a non-citizen. PA meant their first papers, which again is the declaration, were being worked on. NA meant that they were naturalized. NR meant that it was not reported. And then C, or if it was marked blank, that means they were a natural born citizen. The 1940 census does use these same codes, but they also had numbers they might have used. So if they weren't using the AL, PA, and NA, what they were using was 1 for naturalized, 2 was for first papers, 3 was for alien, and then 4 was for foreign born, but they were American citizen at birth. Most of the time you will not find 1, 2, and 3. Most of the time you will only find the number 4. But just note, if you do find a number marked instead of those letters, know that they do have meaning. And then finally, we have the 1950 census, which is our newest census we have. They would just simply mark, yes, they were a citizen, no, they were not, or AP, which meant they had American parents, but they were born abroad. So this would be if someone had parents serving in the military and they were born in a different country, but since their parents were Americans, they would be still a citizen. So let me quickly show you how I use the federal census records to help determine when my ancestor Peter became a citizen. So I found him in multiple censuses. So 1910, it gives us some clues about when he naturalized. And from it, I was able to identify that he likely immigrated about 1890 or 1891, and he might have naturalized around 1898. So it's always good to compare all of the census records of your ancestor to determine what could likely be it, because as you could see, there could be variations in the years. You also don't want to miss out on state census records because they can even include naturalization statuses. We have some from New York that just would say A or C for alien or citizen, or it would be AL or CIT. What's actually interesting, I didn't include an image of it, but the 1925 New York State Census even asked how many years they were living in the US, as well as when and where they naturalized, which could be a great help if you're doing New York research. So again, that was the 1925 New York State Census. So for immigration records, they can also help you. You might not think they would, since this would have occurred before their naturalization, but you could still get some hints about their location and if they intended to become a citizen. So if we look at this first column, we have Eugenio, and it tells us that he was, his final destination was Chicago, Illinois. So he arrived in New York, but he was going to Chicago, so he honestly could have gone through any court between there to become a citizen. We also know he was joining his cousin, so we could do some research on his cousin as well to determine if there's any other naturalization records of his cousin, or determine if he was living with him in a census record. And also, it tells us the purpose that they came to the United States, and it did say he intended to permanently stay in the US, and he did intend to become a citizen. Another record type you can use is voter registers. I absolutely love this record because it tells us that Fred, when he was 22 years old, that he actually naturalized the 6th of October, 1922, and the very next day he had registered to vote. So this tells us, 1, he probably became a citizen because he wanted to vote. 2, it tells us where he was living. And also 3, he naturalized the day before he registered, so he likely naturalized in a court very close to this, if not the exact same court. Passports can also tell you a lot about immigrants, and a lot of immigrants did receive passports so they could go back and visit their homelands. I like this record because it gives you so much information, including where he was born, his immigration. It also tells us that he was naturalized through his father, and it even gives us the date and the court that his father naturalized. So this is very helpful to determine what records we could look for his father. Military records can also provide you great clues with naturalizations, and to enter the US military, you did not have to be a US citizen. So these records could give you some clues of whether or not they were a citizen. If we zoom in to this top portion, we can see that John was born 1893, specifically the city in Germany. It tells us his parents' names, which is a valuable information to learn. It also tells us when he immigrated and that he had completed his first papers as of that date of May 1919. So this is great information to know. We can likely find those declaration papers sometime around where he lived in this time period. Death records might have some less noticeable clues. For this death certificate, there is a column asking how long they were in the US if they were foreign born. And so for Charles, we could see that he was in Idaho for about 25 years and in the US for about 40 years. It does give us his birth in Germany, but doesn't give us a city. We could use this death record to determine whether where he might have naturalized. It could be in Idaho if he did it within the last 25 years, but if not, we would have to do more research to determine where he was living previously. Obituaries might give you more clues than death certificates. For this record, it tells us that he was born in England and he immigrated 52 years previously. And it even tells us the 2 different places that he lived in. He first settled in Pennsylvania and later in 1885 went to West Virginia. So again, we know he lived long enough to become a citizen if he wanted to, and it gives us 2 potential locations of courts to look for and see if we can find it. I had mentioned homestead applications previously. Again, that certificate might be within the homestead paper, which is amazing. But if you can't find that actual certificate of citizenship within that packet, you might be able to find some clues if they became when they became a citizen. On this first image on the left, it does say that he is a naturalized citizen of the US. And then over on the right, it tells us that he was naturalized. It gives us the date he filed or filled out this paper, so we know he would have been naturalized prior to this date. So now that we've discussed some clues that you can go to, let's discuss the website you can go to find the actual naturalization records. This is a list of some websites, but again, there's always going to be a lot more. So let's start with the Family Search Catalog. This is my favorite place to go to find naturalization records. I start with a location search, so I decided to do Colorado. And when I did a Colorado search, I scrolled down to the Naturalization and Citizenship collection. So if you look at this collection highlighted in the orange, it tells us that it is Colorado naturalization records, and it gives us which year it covers. And then the author specifically says it's the district court. So if we had any evidence that he naturalized in a district court, this collection could potentially hold it. Next resource I love to use is the Family Search Wiki. It has a great article of the US naturalization and citizenship, where you can learn more about the history and determine what online collections are available to you, as well as how to use the USCIS. It also gives you more information about the derivative and collective naturalizations if you're interested in it. Ancestry also has many collections for the naturalization. If you go to their card catalog, and if you do a filter by immigration and emigration, then you filter to the citizenship records and then filter down to the US, you will find about 150 collections that you could browse through. Some of these are specific to states or counties, and others are very broad and are the entire United States. You can also go to the National Archives website, and they have a great article on more about naturalization records and as well as how you can locate them. I mentioned the USCIS, which was the federal department that controls these records. It was previously called the Bureau of Immigration Services, then it was called the INS, but today it's the USCIS. Not only will you find records, but you might be able to find more about the history as well. It also holds more than just the declaration, the petition, and the certificate. It holds more naturalization records. I won't go into detail about any of these, but just note that if your ancestor naturalized after 1906, they might be found in additional records, such as the A or C files. They could have a visa file or registry. They could have a certificate of registry or a certificate of arrival. I did briefly mention the certificate of arrival earlier, which again might be found within the packet of declaration and petition. We also had Fold 3, which typically is known for their military records, but they do actually have a non-military section, including passport applications, but they also have naturalization card indexes. So if you just type in naturalization, it will pull up which states that they have those indexes for that you could browse through. So before we dive into my case study to show you how you can use these websites to find your ancestor, let's discuss why you might not find a declaration. First, it could be because of a courthouse issue. Either the court didn't really keep the records, maybe there was a courthouse fire that destroyed the records, or maybe you're just looking at the wrong one and it's in a state that you're not expecting, and that's why you're struggling to find it. There are also other instances why someone might not have to fill in a declaration. So for example, for widows and children, if the husband or father filed for the declaration before they passed away, their widow and minor children only needed their oath of allegiance to complete the process. So therefore, those women and children would not need a declaration or a petition. It would be under their name. It wouldn't be under their name because they wouldn't have needed to file it. As well as those that were serving in the military, they did not need to be citizens, but in order to kind of encourage them to serve in the military, they would simplify the process to become naturalized. So those who were honorably discharged would be able to not have to fill in the declaration, and they only needed to be living in the US for 1 year. And that applied to the Army in 1862, the Navy in 1894, and for those serving in World War I. So again, if they were serving in the military and were honorably discharged, they didn't need to fill in the declaration, they moved straight to the petition. You might also be able to use a petition to determine if there's any other reason why you can't find a declaration. And sometimes the petition includes the act that it was under, because there are so many different types of acts created in the government for these records. So there could be a law at the time that would waiver someone to not have to fill in the declaration. So you might need to do a little bit more research to see if you could determine why your ancestor might not have a declaration. You also might not find a petition. This again could be because of a courthouse. Either they didn't keep the records because they were destroyed, or maybe you're looking at the wrong courthouse. And in some states, people who wanted to vote might not have needed to complete the process. They might have needed to start their naturalization process, which meant to fill the declaration, but they might not have needed to complete it. And then also to purchase land for the federal government, some might have only needed the declaration. And other times people might have just never completed the process, either because they forgot or they decided not to do it anymore. So that was a lot of information. So we're going to kind of summarize it into my case study. I will do this case study for post-1906, but do know the process is the same for pre-1906. You just might not find as much information just due to how these records are made. So I wanted to learn more about William. So what I did is I compiled all that I wanted to learn about him, including the different surnames he might have gone by. And I learned about his birth, his marriage, how many children he had, as well as his residence. So with this basic information, I determined there was a lot of different things I wanted to learn about him. I could identify more about his birth, his marriage, more about his children, if they had any more children, because there were some gaps in those years, or if they immigrated. Well, actually, if I found his naturalization record, I could maybe answer a lot of these questions. So I decided my research plan was to determine if William naturalized, and if so, when. So I began with a census search. This is always a great place to start. I was able to find him in the 1910 all the way up to the 1950 census. And some of them were with his children and some of them were with just his wife. So within this search, I was able to compile it into this table to determine when he likely naturalized. There is an error in the 1940 census saying that he was born in New York, so there is no immigration or naturalization information. But even with that, we could determine that he likely naturalized between 1940, give or take 10 years. But we also know he was in Brooklyn for most of this time, so he likely naturalized in Brooklyn. So I could go ahead and browse through Brooklyn's naturalization records, but that would be a lot of records. So I decided to search for indexes. I went to Ancestry. Ancestry and Fold3 have great collections of index cards for naturalization records, and they're a lot easier to search. So I actually found in this US naturalization record indexes, I actually found William. I went ahead and entered in his information as basic as his birth and the year he probably naturalized, which I just did 1940 since that was in the middle of the time frame I thought he naturalized. And then I went ahead and searched it. And fortunately for me, I only had one record. Before I show you this record though, I want to point out you always want to do various names. So I did do Schmidt-Muller, but I also searched for Schmidt and Smith just to see if there was anyone else that matched closer, but there weren't. So I determined that this was likely him. So my search criteria and the result match fairly closely. So I decided to look at the index card. On this index card, it tells you his residence. It also tells you the date he naturalized, the court, and even the petition number, which is super duper valuable. So if you now that I know the court and I know the petition number, I can now use this information to find him. So I hopped over to the family search catalog. Again, I did a place search, went down to the naturalization and citizenship portion of the catalog for New York. And I was looking for that author who would be the district court. Since it was in Brooklyn, I did some research and I determined that the Brooklyn courts were identified by Eastern. And at the very bottom, we can see that this final petition was the district court, specifically the Eastern District, and the year includes 1945. So I thought, let's look at it. So I opened up this collection, and when you scroll down from this page, it gives you the film information. A lot of these naturalization records are organized either by year or certificate number. And fortunately, since that index tells us the certificate number, I was able to find the collection that he probably would be in. So I went ahead and compared the certificate number, made sure I found the right one, clicked on the camera, and here I have the images. And I could go ahead and browse it until I found someone that matched this name and the petition number. So I went and I found that petition number and it matched. So I determined this is the same one from the index card. Now I just need to analyze it to determine if this is the same William Schmidt-Muller that I'm researching. Again, you always want to browse to see if there's multiple pages, and there were. So I was able to find a certificate of arrival, his declaration, his petition, and his witness and oath. So let's quickly go through and identify all of the great information that we learn about William. First, we have a certificate of arrival. Here is what they look like. They're just simple index cards. Just tells you basic facts of the port that they arrived in, the date, and the manner of their arrival, so the vessel that they were on, and he was on a railway. On the next page, we see his declaration. The top portion tells us his name and also his name he formerly went by. It tells us his address, his age, his birth, as well as his physical description. So if I had any other documents, such as a World War I or II draft card that gave his description, I could use that to verify it was him. It tells us more information about his marriage, as well as his wife's birth information, as well as the 3 children, which all match. Interestingly enough, I can use their birthplaces to also try to track more about their immigration, since they came from Germany to Algeria to Canada and then into the United States. Then I can learn more about specifically where they last were living in Montreal, and again, where they arrived through, which is the same information we found on the certificate of arrival. And then my favorite portion of these petitions, or excuse me, these declarations, is that they include a photograph as well as his signature. And since I had a photograph of William, I was able to compare it, and it concluded that this indeed is him. So even though the information from the declaration and petition are pretty similar, you still want to analyze it just to make note of if there's anything conflicting. The only thing conflicting on this page was his age, but that makes sense since we know that typically with 2 to 3 years between the first and second papers. So that explains his age difference. And again, it gives us his description as well as his marriage. We can identify more about his arrival as well as his children. It also explains his affidavit of witnesses. It tells us who they were. I find this interesting because his son, Edward, is actually the witness. And I find it interesting that he went by the last name Schmidt, while his father went by Smith or Schmidt-Muller. So this goes to show you that even within close generations, the names are always changing, especially for these immigrants, which is why it's so important to create a good list of different names they could have gone by. And then finally, we have his oath of allegiance, and it again is signed by him and dated. So when you have this information, you want to go ahead and compare it with what you know and what you don't know, as well as with the information from each page. I did notice that the birthplace was different for Anna. I did some research on this town though, and it actually has been part of both France and Germany. It's gone back and forth throughout history, particularly around the World Wars. So that would explain the difference in the country. If you remember though, it's always good to look at images around what you're looking for because you never know what you're going to find. And I'm sure glad I did because I actually found Anna's naturalization. There was no evidence in the census records that she ever naturalized. And this was after the time that a woman would have become a citizen through her husband. And so I had no clue if she naturalized or not. But because I found William's, I actually found hers. I again went through every single record I had of her, read every column, analyzed all the information, compared the facts. I actually confirmed that France was the country that was stated most likely her birth. So it probably was French at the time of her birth. And so then I came to the conclusion of what I was able to discover about Anna and William. I could find more about their birth and their marriage, learned about their residence in Canada and that they immigrated from when they immigrated from Canada. We can find their naturalization when they were residing in New York, as well as their children, their names, birth dates, and residence, as well as their pictures, which I thought was a great addition to have. So even though I did answer my research question of if they naturalize and if so when, I can still find future research. I could determine if their children ever naturalized. I didn't point this out, but I actually was missing rows on the naturalization records, and it was likely because she probably passed away, but I would need to do research to figure out why she wasn't there. And then also determine those immigration records from Canada, as well as seeing if there's any passenger lists that they took from Europe into Canada. And also, I would also want to determine if they had any more children. So that is naturalization records. We discussed the history and background. We learned why they are so valuable and the differences between those 3 time periods. We learned how to properly analyze and use these records, the various websites you can use to find, and then we put that all together to find the naturalization record for William and Anna. So I don't know if we have any time for questions, but I'm happy to stay and answer some if we need to.
Teresa says, thank you, this was excellent. Do you have any reference books to read for further research?
That is a great question. I know the Family Search Wiki does include some references that you can go to. I have linked that article into the handout, but you can just search for United States Naturalization and Citizenship. And at the bottom, they usually include some references that you can go to for some reference books.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on June 1st with James Tanner. He will be giving a presentation entitled Finding Success with Genealogical Research Strategy. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can do that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fho_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.